For Dragonflight Season 1, I decided to make my Protection Warrior my main class. No surprise there. But what if I could go and start over? I mean, it's a video game, I can do whatever I want, but for the last 5 years I have been a Guardian Druid main, and for the last 5 years or so I felt like I was always playing from behind when it comes to Mythic Plus, so this time I wanted a change of scenery and a change of pace. Don't get me wrong, Warrior is incredibly powerful from its fast-paced playstyle, to its immense toolkit, to its damage profile and its healing. But if I were to start fresh today, what tank would I play? And that's what this video is about. I want to talk about some general stats, class performances, and then my personal preference in general when it comes to tank playstyle. So let's dive in. I guess the first place I would like to start is with statistics, and we're going to start with Subcreation, my all-time favorite site. Oh, look, Bear's the worst. No surprise there. Jokes aside, the tank balance has actually been stupid good this season outside of a few niche circumstances. So if you're concerned about a class being far behind, don't. If we scroll through each week of fixes, you're going to actually see that most tanks move up and down this tier list. This happens for a multitude of reasons, but ultimately shows that some tanks are better with some affixes than others, alongside with their group composition, gear, and obviously popularity. While sites like Subcreation are great, they really only aggregate data from the top keys, so naturally, if there are 40% more players playing Warrior, they will appear stronger in the data. The point I'm trying to make with this is that all tanks can perform at some level, so to prove it to you, let's jump over to Raider.io. Most of you are probably pretty familiar with the site, but just in case you aren't, this is a great tool to check out player profiles, leaderboards, builds, and just different tips and tricks. This site is actually definitely a one-stop shop for all your dungeon and raid needs, but if we gander over at the Mythic Plus rankings, you can actually see a breakdown of popularity of classes. While Warrior is pretty predominant, you'll see all 6 tanks being represented here. Here, this is for level 10s and higher, but let's change it to 15 plus. While the numbers do change slightly, still all 6 are being represented, so what about 20 plus? Yup, all 6 are still being represented. If you're a player who just wants to get into Mythic Plus, I highly recommend playing whatever tank you prefer. It's no secret that Protection Warrior is incredibly powerful, but what else is competitive for doing keys? Well, we can use Raider.io to manually look at the leaderboards ourselves. We can expect to see a ton of brown when you look at this leaderboard, but you're also going to notice that the color palette isn't monochromatic. You're going to see actually a pretty strong representation of 3 different classes on this front page. Blood Death Knight and Protection Paladin alike are definitely repping themselves here. But if we start scrolling within the next page or two, we're going to actually see a couple of Demon Hunters and even a Brewmaster Monk. Now, while we won't see a Guardian Druid until page 5 or so, it's still a tank that can be utilized for pushing keys. It does have more weaknesses than others, but on a note of Copium, they are getting reworked in 10.0.5, so hopefully that'll give them the boost that they need. Okay, so what do these tanks bring to the table, and what strengths do they have? Protection Paladin is an insane tank right now, and it can provide so much to the group. It really has a high amount of damage through abilities like Shield of the Righteous and Divine Toll, and while Avenger Shield does not generate holy power anymore, it still does silence and interrupt enemies. Blessings alongside all of their 5 defensives make them actually extremely sturdy, which wasn't always the case in previous expansions. If you're someone who primarily pugs, this is a great choice. Death Knight, on the other hand, is another standout tank. While they might not have consistently the top damage, they are right on par with some of the other tanks in certain instances. The biggest attraction that I personally think that the Death Knight possesses is their ability to not need a healer. And while this isn't really a surprise, this is definitely a season where there's a ton of unavoidable group damage, and there's a high amount of stress on a healer to be able to keep the party alive. Because Death Knights don't need a healer at all, this is theoretically reducing the healing that the healer needs to do by upwards of 20%. Outside of heavy group damage, the healer can now focus on either spot healing or damage. On top of that, Death Knight also brings a lot of agency over mob control, from Death Grip to Gore Fiends to Abomination Limb to Mind Freeze to Blinding Sleet, Asphyxiate, and the list goes on and on. Other tanks bring great resources and tools as well, and I can spend a whole video dissecting each tank, but I'm just not. It's pretty clear that on the data that we've looked at that these 3 tanks are the top dogs. Okay, so if I were to reroll today, what would I pick? Well, regardless of performance, my all-time favorite tank to play is Brewmaster. Going into Dragonflight, it seemed that Brewmaster though was getting beaten to a pulp, just nerf after nerf, and ultimately that's what caused me not to play it. Another tank that I really enjoyed playing despite popularity is actually the Protection Paladin. I'm very, very fond of the Dusk and Dawn playstyle, and for some reason I really enjoy Avenger Shield not generating holy power. Yes, you probably heard me correctly. I just think it makes the class a little bit more methodical compared to its Shadowlands counterpart. Originally, I was going to main Paladin followed by the Warrior, but with how unlucky the character got the first few weeks, Rare and Mythic 0 farming, I just decided to put it on the back burner for the time being. If I were to start gearing and pushing on a tank today, I would think I would pick either of these two. Starting with a Paladin, this tank clearly has a slightly higher potential if you take into account the data from Subcreation, Raider.io, and Warcraft logs. After playing Bear for 5 years, I'm just personally at the point where class strength is pretty important to me, but there has to be some balance. Death Knight also appears strong, but I personally just don't like the playstyle as much as I enjoy playing something like Protection Paladin. Brewmaster is something I just thoroughly enjoy. The damage intake of this tank is by far the smoothest of any of the tanks, allowing the player to react at their leisure, and healers know that there will never be any crazy spikes. With that being said, the largest deterrent in my eyes would be the amount of items a Brewmaster currently needs. While their base kit has a ton of great cooldowns, it seems that there are a lot of items that they're still chasing and almost feel required to be able to push keys. There are items like the Cobalt Ring or Rare Rings from the raid. There are also a few different trinkets that they can use or need to bolster their survivability. This class's survivability is night and day based on what items the user has. While I personally love farming gear, that's just best in slot, I don't ever feel a tank or a class in general should be dependent on the items it gets to feel good to play. The best example I can give is the Seal of Filial Duty from Broodkeeper Daruna. I happened to snag one from my vault 2 weeks ago and my HPS and keys jumped up by over 15%. If you look at my healing breakdown after most keys, most of the time 30% or more of my healing comes from tertiary items like ring effects or trinkets. I feel this is turning into a rant, so I'm gonna close it here, but long story short, if I were to reroll today, I would probably choose Protection Paladin, or more than likely the Brewmaster Monk. So, Future Shaw here. As I was in the middle of editing this video, they actually buffed Brewmaster Monk, and they increased the effectiveness of Stagger against magical damage, and they reduced the cooldown of Celestial Brew. So yeah, Brewmaster is just OP now. But honestly, if you find yourself trying to figure out what tank to play or feel that the current class you're playing doesn't feel great, consider trying something else. I can't stress this enough that all tanks are in a great position. Anyways, I hope you all enjoyed this video. I thought it was a fun little topic to talk about, and huge shout out to my lovely patrons because without them, there'd be much less of this. Hope you're all staying happy, healthy, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Peace.